Grade 11, Chapter 1, The Portrait of a Lady. The author of the chapter is Khushwant Singh. He is an Indian author. The Portrait of a Lady is a part of an autobiography by Khushwant Singh. In this story, the author draws a pen portrait of his grandmother. He beautifully unfolds their relationship and how it undergoes several changes. This is what he talks about himself and his grandmother and how their relationship did grow with time. In other words, the story is a loving tribute from a grandson to his grandmother. This story gives us a picture of human relationships. It is a realistic account of how the grandparents give all their time, attention, and love to their grandchildren. Let us read the story and find out how Khushwant Singh's grandmother was and why did he think that she was somebody who was loving and caring. Khushwant Singh's grandmother is described as an extremely religious person. She was a very kind lady. She was short and slightly bent. Her face was wrinkled and she was always dressed in spotless white clothes. In the village, she took care of all the needs of the author when he was a child. The author recounts his childhood days and his relationship with his grandmother. The author says, "My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had been knowing her. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe." Why do you think the poet says so? The author remembers his grandmother and grandfather. The author recalls his grandmother as a very old lady. For the 20 years that the author had known his grandmother, he had found her old and wrinkled. So this is what he thinks about his grandmother. He feels that she might have been young and pretty when she was young, and it was hard for him to believe that she was married and she had a husband. Why does he say so? Why it was hard for him to believe that she had once been young and pretty and she had a husband? Khushwant Singh's grandfather's portrait hung on the wall of the drawing room. Highlight how he wore a big turban, his clothes were loose, he looked at least 100 years old. Looking at his portrait, One could not imagine him in his youth with his wife and children. The author's grandmother seems to have been strong. She was strong willed and determined. She was independent, and this is why the author feels that it was hard for him to believe that she had once been young and pretty and she had a husband. The thought of the grandmother being young and pretty was almost revolting to him. Although she was short and slightly bent in stature, her face was a crisscross of wrinkles. Her silvery white hair was scattered over her wrinkled face, but still she looked beautiful. The author remembered her hobbling around the house in spotless white clothes. Means she was well dressed. To the author, she could never have been pretty, but she reflected a divine beauty. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Although she was quite old, she never failed to do her prayers. She used to count the beads of her rosary and pray to God. When the author talks about how his grandfather was, he describes the photograph of his grandfather. He feels that he had been quite old, and he seemed to be 100 years old. The author and his grandmother were good friends. His parents left him to stay with her when they shifted to the city. In the village, his grandmother took good care of the author. She was quite active and agile. She used to wake him up in the morning and get him ready for school. She said her morning prayers while she bathed and dressed him in the hope that her grandson would learn them by heart. The author listened to the prayers because he loved her voice, but never bothered to learn them. So this is what we learn about how the author's grandmother was and how she took great care of him when he was a child. The author's grandmother accompanied him to the school. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. Why did she accompany the author to school? She used to drop the author to school and go to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. So she used to go with the grandson, visit the temple, do her prayers, read the scriptures, and make the author learn the prayers as well. This shows that she was spiritual. She believed in spirituality. The priest taught children the alphabet and the morning prayer, and the children used to sit in rows, two rows, in the veranda and learn the prayers. While the author learnt his lessons at school, the grandmother would read scriptures in the adjoining temple. On their way back, they would feed stale chapatis to the dogs. The turning point in the relationship of grandmother and the author was marked when his parents settled in the city. They even called them. They sent for us, he says. Why? Because he wanted the author and his grandmother to settle down with them in the city. Now that was a turning point in our friendship, he says. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. The turning point came in their relationship when they moved to the city to stay with Khusran Singh's parents. In the city, the author went to an English school in a motor bus, or the bus. The grandmother could not accompany him to the school. As there were no dogs in the street, the grandmother took to feeding the sparrows in the city. As the years rolled by, they saw less of each other. In spite of her immense interest in his studies, she could not help him with his lessons or studies as he was learning English. The law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, and many more lessons where she thought she would not be able to help him. She could not understand what was being taught in the school, and this made her feel unhappy. Sometimes she would ask him what the teacher had taught him. This is how she took great interest in what was taught in the school. Why was the grandmother distressed and disturbed? The author's grandmother did not believe in the things taught at the English school and was distressed to learn that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures in the school. Moreover, she was very disturbed at the idea of music lessons being given at the English school. To her, music had lewd associations, and she considered music to be unsuitable for gentlefolk. The common link of friendship got snapped. Why did it happen and when did it happen? When I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. The common link of friendship between the author and the grandmother was broken when the author went to the university and was given a room of his own. The grandmother accepted her loneliness and rarely spoke to anyone. All day long she sat spinning the wheel and reciting her prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. The sparrows perched on her shoulders and some even on her head, but she never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. So, this is what we learn about the grandmother, how the things had changed when the author went to the university to pursue his studies or education. What had happened when the author left for higher studies? When I decided to go abroad for further studies, I was sure my grandmother would be upset. I would be away for 5 years, and at her age, one could never tell. But my grandmother could. She was not even sentimental. She came to leave me at the railway station but did not talk or show any emotion. So, this is how his grandmother reacted when she went to drop him at the railway station when he was going abroad to pursue his higher studies. The author decided to go abroad for higher studies for 5 years. He was sure that his grandmother would be upset at his departure, but to his surprise, she was not even sentimental. She went to the railway station to see him off. She showed no emotion. She was absorbed in praying and counting the beads of her rosary. Silently, she kissed his forehead. The author thought that perhaps it was the last sign of physical contact between them. Why did the poet, why did the author think so? The author thought so because she had grown quite old, and he thought that after 5 long years he would not be able to see her. He might have assumed that she might not be alive once he is back home. What happens next when the author returns home after 5 long years? When the author was back home after 5 years, he was welcomed by his grandmother. After 5 years, the author found his grandmother at the station when he returned. She held him in her arms. He found her more religious and more self contained. He could hear her reciting prayers. Even that day, the happiest moment for her was feeding the sparrows herself. However, something strange happened to her in the evening. What we learn about her in the given lines is that she was not emotional when she went to drop her grandson to the station when he was going abroad. When he was back home after 5 long years, she was happy to see him. She chanted her prayers and counted the beads of the rosary. But late in the evening, the author could observe that something strange had happened to her. What was that? What did she do? And why did she do something like that? After 5 years, I came back home and was met by her at the station. She did not look a day older. She seemed to be as pretty as she was when the author left her when he went abroad. After seeing the author after such a long time, for the first time ever, she did not pray. Instead, she collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing songs of the homecoming of warriors. They tried to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining herself, but she didn't listen, and ultimately she fell ill the next morning. So, after seeing the grandson, she welcomed her grandson by beating the drum and celebrating the homecoming of the author as if he was a warrior. Her family members persuaded her to stop to avoid overstraining, but she refused to listen. She fell ill the next morning, and her family members were worried about her. It was for the first time that the author could observe that she did not pray. The author's grandmother was diagnosed with a mild fever by the doctor, but she insisted that her end was near. Although she celebrated the homecoming of her grandson, she seemed to be happy, but she was also sure that her end was near. She told everyone that she did not want to talk to anyone and would rather spend her last moments praying. The next morning, when she was taken ill, his grandmother seems to have been thinking differently. She told the family members that her end was near and she wanted to be left alone. Since only a few hours before the close of the last chapter of her life, she had omitted to pray. She was not going to waste any more time talking to others. So at first it was like she wanted to pray, and this is why she did not want to talk to her family members. But later on, before she closed her eyes, she had omitted to pray.